Grandma's Voices is sponsored by a grant through the Michigan Council for Humanities, through the Kellogg Foundation, the Dara Eyes Foundation, and Grand Valley State University, as well as Bayard Art Consulting. Hi, I'm George Bayard, Executive Director of the African American Museum and Archives, or GRAMA, and this project is called Grandma's Voices. Grandma's Voices is an oral history project that documents African Americans who moved here from the turn of the century to Grand Rapids in the western Michigan area. We're talking to African Americans from all walks of life, from every corner of the county, from as far as Benton Harbor all the way up to Idlewild. These conversations tell us about things that happened here in West Michigan that's not normally recorded in everyday history. We now present Grandma's Voices. On this side, I would like to introduce Jaqueline James. She's a local author that, from Grand Rapids, but lives in Georgia right now. And she's written a series of books for children's books, and adults. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about her book series.
Hello, everyone. As you said, I'm Jaqueline James. I'm a product of Grand Rapids Public Schools. And my first 5 years of teaching, the 32 years, was in Grand Rapids Public Schools. I live in Georgia now. And I'm writing a series of books called Friends of Martin Luther King. And the reason that I'm writing it is because my teaching career kept going and going and going. I saw that Black history was being taken out of our schools, and we just sat there and let it happen. So now it's very little Black history in our schools. But then I realized that all our children, they think they know about Martin Luther King. They really don't know a lot about him. They know he got shot, and they know he was asleep and had a dream, and that's about all they know. I met a gentleman named Reverend C.T. Vivian, and he was such a fascinating man to me. And I said, "Can I write a book about you?" And he said, "Yes, you can write a book about me." Well, while I was doing research on him, I ran into all these other people that had also worked with Martin Luther King. So I just turned it into a series. It started out at 18 people. Now there are 28 people on my list because I keep meeting people and they say, "Oh, you got to tell about so-and-so. He was his doctor. He was the lawyer. He was this." So I've completed 5 books so far. The first one was Reverend C.T. Vivian. And a lot of people, if anybody here has had any affiliations with Upward Bound, they have this man to thank. He was the start of Upward Bound. He is very unique. He has the distinction of being asked by Martin Luther King to join Martin Luther King. He didn't come and ask Martin Luther King if he could join. The reason that he asked him was in 1960, he performed, as Martin Luther King said, the most perfect nonviolent movement ever. In Nashville, Tennessee, there was a strike on the stores, and there was a lawyer that helped all the students, got them out of jail, gave them free legal advice, and so the Ku Klux Klan blew up his house, but before it messed up. I'll show you how dumb they are. It only blew up the front porch, but across the street it blew up 147 windows out of Meharry Medical School. So that was at 6 o'clock in the morning. By noon, Reverend Vivian had organized a march of 4,000 people, and they marched from Tennessee State University to Nashville, downtown Nashville, 3.5 miles in complete silence. It's called the Silent March. Martin Luther King was so impressed with him that he asked him to come and join with him at SCLC. Also in 1947, in 1960, we hear about all those sit-ins in North Carolina. But in 1947, which was a long time ago because that was the year I was born, he integrated all the downtown restaurants in Peoria, Illinois. You never hear about that. This is the only man that has interviewed and gave counsel to 5 different presidents: President Johnson, President Carter, President Obama, President Reagan, and President Clinton. He's given advice to all of them. He received the Congressional Medal of Freedom from President Obama recently, 2 years ago. He's now 91 years old. Every Saturday, he still mentors young men. He has a program, gets up every Saturday and mentors young men for 4 hours at 91. The next book I wrote was Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. When you hear about everything that happened in Birmingham, whose name do you hear? Martin Luther King. Reverend Shuttlesworth was there from 1957 all the way up through 1963. He endured all the beatings. He went to jail 25 times. His house was bombed 3 times. The parsonage by his church was bombed 3 times. His daughter and I are very good friends now. We travel together. We do speaking engagements together. All of his children 2 are older than me. One's my age and one's younger. But she told me one day, and she doesn't know how this impacted me, that when she was 11 years old, that was the first time that their house was bombed. And she said from that day on, they couldn't do anything without two or three brothers and sisters being together. They could not walk to school and back to school. They had to be chauffeured, driven everywhere. And when I talk to students, they always say, "Oh, that sounds like fun, that sounds like fun." I say, "Yeah, but it gets kind of old after a week or two when your friends are walking home, having fun, and you're in a car, and all you can do is get driven from school to home, and then stay in the house like a prisoner." I said, when I was 11, I remember I was up there on Church Street. I don't know if anybody knows where that is, jumping rope and playing jacks and all that stuff, and here they were locked in the house. And she said the worst thing that ever happened to her sister, who was 2 years older than her, she had to go on her first date with her because they weren't allowed to go anywhere alone. So she said that was the worst thing ever happened to her during that time, having to go on a date with her big sister. He received a Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. He was beaten mercilessly, do you hear me, mercilessly, within an inch of his death, for trying to integrate bus terminals, airport terminals, and everything. Now, when you fly into Birmingham, the airport is named after him. The next person I wrote about was Reverend Wyatt T. Walker. Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, I know you've never heard that name because I hadn't heard of it either. Martin Luther King called him, he told him he had the keenest mind of anybody in the civil rights movement, saying how smart he was. This picture that you often see of Martin Luther King in jail, it was Reverend Wyatt T. Walker who smuggled this camera in to the jail at the risk of beating, death, and everything else, and took that picture. Because I always wondered, how'd they get that picture of him? I also, when I was researching him, I found a picture of Reverend Walker in jail. He told me and I met him, he told me he got the camera across the aisle, across the jail aisle, I guess he was talking about, and Martin Luther King also took that picture of him. That's not in the book, but when I do a reprint, I'm going to put that picture in there also. One of the most important things about him is we read about and students study the letter from the Birmingham jail. Well, you always hear that Martin Luther King wrote it on little pieces of paper, newspaper scrapings and everything. Well, he smuggled those pieces out with his lawyer, and Wyatt T. Walker got out of jail a few days before him. He's the man who took all those scraps of pieces of paper together and put it together and made that letter. So without Reverend Walker, we wouldn't have even had the letter from the Birmingham jail. And the first time he was arrested for trying to integrate the library. He, his wife, and 2 children were arrested. Now, in Petersburg, Virginia, they're building a new library, and they're going to name it after him. So he's come full circle also. He's still alive. Reverend Shuttlesworth died after I got the manuscript to him, he died 3 hours later after his wife read it to him. The next person I wrote about was Dorothy Cotton. She was the only woman and the highest ranking woman on the SCLC. And for those of you who don't know, it's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's something that Martin Luther King and Reverend Shuttlesworth, Reverend Lowry, and 5 other ministers started. And are still alive today, still working, still functioning. It's a great historical civil rights organization. We always tell students, are you ready? Are you registered to vote? You need to go register to vote. Well, there was a time when blacks couldn't register to vote. She was one of the persons who taught them how to register to vote, because if you've never done it, you don't know how to do it. So she went around and she'd have workshops once a month and teach people how to register to vote, how to become a citizen, because they weren't allowed to. As I read and research, I see how many people are so interrelated. Dorothy Cotton and Reverend C.T. Vivian, they held marches in St. Augustine, Florida. They held them at night because if the people that marched during the day, they would lose their jobs. Can you imagine, pitch dark, and you got little flashlights and no telling who's there to shoot you and everything else? She said that was the scariest time of her life, marching down the street. She took some children to integrate the beach, the Atlantic Ocean. They couldn't even swim in the Atlantic Ocean. Men and everything beat her and the kids up for trying to swim in the Atlantic Ocean. And the final book that I just finished was Reverend and Mrs. Joseph Lowry. Reverend Lowry, he's still alive. He'll be 94 on October 6th. So, but one thing I want you to know about him, we always see all these toxic waste hearings and everything. He was the start of that. He went to North Carolina and he marched against it because they were just throwing toxic waste in the poor neighborhoods. And that's what started the toxic waste environmental issues. He worked for 60 years, and he's still working as a civil rights worker. At the end of the movie, if you saw Selma, and it ended with Martin Luther King speaking, it didn't end there. It ended when he took those demands up to Governor Wallace. That's when the march really ended. So I think that should have been in the movie, but I'm not the producer, so yeah, but he's there. And then as I was researching him, I found out so much about his wife. She started SCLC Women, and she said women and children and families have different issues, so she set up educational programs. She set up health programs. She went around and she started all types of, she set up like 13 monuments throughout the city, throughout the Alabama, to honor these fallen heroes.